afternoon, everyone. Ooh, that's very loud. And welcome to the lunchtime book session on the final day of the conference. I'm delighted to welcome Dan Saladino, who's going to talk about his wonderful book, Eating to Extinction. Copies are available at the Blackwell bookshop downstairs, and the paperback copy is coming out next week. Can I just check you can all hear me okay in the audience? Up. You want me to speak up? Louder. Hold the book up or speak louder.
Speak louder, I think.
Louder. I'm hoping they're looking at the tech people.
We need some more volume.
Could we have some volume in the hall?
Yeah, and I think things are... Thank you.
Is that better? Louder still. Louder still. I'm getting the signal. Yes. I can, yeah. Yep. Is that better? Yeah, okay. Yeah, Thank you. So welcome to the lunchtime session. I'm delighted. I'm going to welcome you all again to discuss Dan Saladino's book, Eating to Extinction, which came out in 2021. Copies available downstairs. And I'm delighted to say the paperback is out next week. Dan is, of course, a well-known food journalist and radio broadcaster. And the obvious question to start with is, why write a book and why this book?
Because the very simple answer is I found and fell in love with the stories in the book. So I joined the food program back in 2007. And by a stroke of luck, when I was asked, because it's a weekly program and it's very busy and needs lots and lots of ideas, and so when I was invited onto the program and Sheila said, well, what kind of idea do you want to work with for your first program? And I panicked and just fell back on what I know, which is my family background in Sicily, and I knew the citrus harvest was underway. And I persuaded them that I could travel on my own and go and record in some citrus groves what I thought was a celebratory story of these wonderful fruits that had shaped the landscape and the culture, the identity of Sicilians for 1,000 years, or the people of Sicily for 1,000 years. And I arrived to stories of farmers explaining to me it was the last harvest, and that many of these small-scale producers, it no longer made any economic sense for them to carry on growing the oranges. And this was particularly around Etna, where there were the blood oranges. And I went to a meal where they were trying to raise the profile of these fruits by having a menu of 5 courses. Each course had the blood orange as an ingredient. And they just wanted to try and explain to the community, to fellow Sicilians, that these foods matter, and that they had shaped the landscape, and they were an important part of their history, and delicious. And sitting at me at the table was somebody who'd travelled from the town of Bra in the north of Italy, and said that these oranges should be added to the Ark of Taste. And I had no idea what those words meant at the time. And then I came to realise that the Ark of Taste, as in Noah's Ark of Taste, was a project they had created as Slow Food International in the 1990s, when they were seeing the rapid disappearance of Italian regional food and ingredients and animal breeds and crop varieties. And so they created a catalogue by which people around the world could tell their story of saying, this is where I am in the world, these are the foods that have fed us and enabled people to survive in this part of the world for centuries, if not millennia, and they are disappearing. And it was a place where people could send in those stories. And today there are more than 5,000 endangered foods in the Ark of Taste catalogue from 150 different countries. And as a journalist interested in food, it became, it was like a treasure trove, really, because each one of these foods took you to a place, to a people, to history, to the reasons why diversity arrived in the first place, how crops adapted, how animal breeds adapted, and then, more recently, why they were disappearing so quickly in so many parts of the world. And the most important question, perhaps, is why should we care? And that's the question that I started with when I wanted to write a book about these foods that I'd spent a decade making radio programs about these individual endangered foods, thinking, wow, what a wonderful history, what a wonderful story, how sad is disappearing, move on to another story. And then in writing the book, the opportunity to join the dots and actually think that this is a global story that was unfolding, and also a story that took me back. I think the oldest kind of time reference in the book is about 2.5 billion years. So, I fell in love with these stories, but I wanted to make sense of them, and I wanted to tell the world that they mattered beyond the perception that they are just quaint traditions that we can consign to history, and in fact, they need to be part of our future, was the argument I was presenting.
And it powerfully connects actually to one of the sessions that was held this morning about connecting the dots and moving food and the way that we think about to the producers, away from the consumers to some extent. For those of you that haven't had the chance to read the book, what Dan's just described is what makes it such a wonderful read. I'm the professor of modern history here in Oxford, so I spend a lot of my time reading history books, and they're not nearly, many of them are not nearly as readable as this one. Dan makes a very powerful case for the importance of history, but it's also delightfully, it's an easy read, and it's something you can pick up and put down, and all of us have got busy lives, especially if you have to keep going out to the field and coming back in again, because the stories are sort of bite-sized, but they're hung on a very powerful architecture that makes the case for diversity and for the importance of producers, for food scientists, and for people who sought to preserve those cultures or kept them in different ways. But of course, this book came out last year. The paperback is coming out now. Food's been in the news a lot because of the war in Ukraine and because of other types of disruption, the COVID pandemic. So what's changed in the way that you think about your material now?
Well, I do feel the conversation is changing, and I think even when I think about the word biodiversity, biological diversity, that wasn't such a common word in political discourse or even about the environment and climate change, but it very much is now. And I think the idea of agricultural biological diversity or agrobiodiversity, which is one of the themes I touch on, because the book isn't just about food security and crop diversity, it is about culture and identity and history and science. But I think the awareness that we need options for the future, that there are fragilities that have been exposed whether through the pandemic and supply chains, and particularly with what we've learnt, or what the war in Ukraine has revealed to us about the relatively small number of regions that produce so much of our food, and that there's so much uniformity globally. And then when that system starts to break down and be challenged, we are now seeing not just the ripples, but we are seeing the waves that, throughout the world, and the impact at every level, national and also individual households as well. So I think the politics, the economics, the disruption around the world, I think adds to the argument that diversity can contribute an awful lot to future resilience. But also the other thing that's changing all the time and has changed since writing the book is the science. So I refer to some of the challenges we face, whether it's fungal diseases impacting famously on banana cultivation and the Cavendish, but actually that's just a gateway story into a world in which wheat, rice, all of our crops are increasingly under threat because of the genetic uniformity, the impact of climate change, the lack or overabundance in some cases of water, issues of salinity and all of these things. I think the world is now waking up to the fact that there are genetic traits and diversity that will contribute and be a positive force in future food security. But the science, and the next session on Feeding Britain is going to be doing this as well, is that connection between what we grow, what we produce, and how we eat, and our health. And I think the really powerful thing for me is that the science is growing and growing about the importance of diversity in human evolution, and also the lack of diversity in modern diets and the impact that that's having on our health. So most people in this room will be aware of the growing, relatively new science of the gut microbiome, but the more research that we hear about now about the chemical compounds in our food, and the mapping it's almost like the Human Genome Project for food is underway now to actually map the chemical compounds. And one of the big conclusions that scientists are putting forward is that diversity has mattered in our evolution, and it matters to our health today. So I think the arguments are growing that diversity really does matter and will do so in the future.
I think what I find so interesting about what you've just said and the case that you make in the book is I can't work out whether to feel optimistic or pessimistic about it, because as a historian I'm aware that this sense of the importance of diversity in diet was there right at the beginning of nutritional science in the mid-19th century, and then as it developed really in the early 20th century. But each time there's an awareness of it, it gets squeezed out, it gets forgotten in the drive to push uniformity, because the challenge of feeding people and of poverty is so powerful that, and actually the search for profit is so powerful that it overrides it. And you can see that time and again. So do you feel optimistic or pessimistic, and what do you see as the core challenge, or do you have an answer, anticipating the next session, to that conundrum of moving from 1 billion people to 8 billion people in the last century, and how we feed them?
Well, I think history is important because it does show us that these are not new arguments. And for example, when I was writing the cheese chapters and researching what was unfolding with the move to the pasteurization of liquid milk, as it moved around increasingly as urban centres were growing and then people were becoming ill, but also the way in which that process was then applied to cheese making as well. And that to understand that in the 1920s, because the science had been around in the second half of the 19th century but didn't really become public policy until the 1920s, to then stumble across this idea that there was a movement of so-called vitalists who were concerned about what was being stripped from food, and that they had this belief, and they didn't have access to all of the science, that something was being lost in the food. But possibly at a more fundamental level, the idea that 100 years ago the Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov was traveling around the world, crossing 5 continents, collecting seeds, because he urgently believed at that time that genetic diversity was essential for the future of humanity. He had grown up at a time in Russia in which famine was a recent memory. He ended up going to the so-called Fertile Crescent, collecting seeds for the future of wheat production in the Soviet Union. He traveled to the Americas and the Andes in search of the ancestors of the potato as well. Again, the Irish potato famine was relatively recent memory. And so he understood that the diversity that he would find in the centres of origin, or centres of diversity, were resources that we would need for the future, because they gave us options. I guess the depressing thing is, we had these amazing thinkers and scientists, Vavilov included, but they were pretty much ignored. And the lessons haven't been learnt. And we did continue down the route of thinking that, I guess, production, yield, crop breeding for the convenience of, I guess, the more intensive agricultural systems, and food processing were the priorities, and diversity was lost rapidly. And so we end up with seed vaults and seed banks inspired by Vavilov, but the absence of diversity in the farmers' fields. But I think it's a almost positive negative position to be saying that I think it's inevitable that we will increasingly be aware of the fragility of the lack of diversity as climate becomes a more pressing issue for food production and as the current food system impacts increasingly on public health budgets. I just think history is on the side of Vavilov.
Yeah. And I suppose the other thing that the book tracks is how, and I was surprised by this really, it hadn't occurred to me this way till I read your account of the Alplinsen. So this is a particular lentil that was grown in Schwabia in Germany until the 1960s, and then it kind of was pushed out of production because of the people because of the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic boom. People left the farm, this sort of small German family farm, and at the same time cheap imports of lentils coming from India and so on. And then local farmers very recently, they even sort of thought it was called something else, and then they recovered it. And that's an extraordinarily fast. I mean, I was appalled in a way that people had forgotten their own history so quickly, because it seemed to happen almost overnight.
I think it's one of my favourite stories in the book, because, again, it takes you back through time. So the idea of lentils being part of the Neolithic package, when those hunter-gatherers were interacting with wild plants and domesticating them. The so-called Neolithic package included not only wheat and barley, but also chickpeas and lentils. And as we see those populations disperse over time from the Fertile Crescent, ingredients such as the lentil eventually make their way into Europe. And in that part of Germany, that southern part of Germany, challenging, mountainous, not the best place to be growing crops, the lentil was one of the most important foods. It was important for crop rotation. It was important for survival in terms of it being a food that could be stored. And it then, I guess, shaped a culture and an identity, which is why when the lentil went extinct, this particular type of lentil, Swabian lentil, which I've tasted, and it's wonderful, the texture, the flavour is so different to any other lentil I've tasted. When it went extinct, and there was one farmer who was convinced that something important to his part of the world had been lost, he went on a mission in search of the lost lentil. Could it be found in a seed bank, he wondered. Had anyone come to the region and saved the lentil? And he contacted every single seed bank that he could, and the answer was no. There was no record under the name of this lentil. He ended up traveling with a small group of farmers from Swabia to Russia, to the Vavilov Institute, which had been obviously founded by Vavilov. And there's an amazing picture which you can find online of him arriving at the Vavilov Institute. He'd had a conversation with the curators, and they said, no, we don't have it, but we might have something similar. And they looked under the location, and actually they did have it, but they'd recorded it under the wrong name. There was
the Alpenlinsel.
And there's a moment captured in a photo of him with his arms raised, this farmer in his 60s, being reunited with his lentil. And in a sense, it's a powerful photo because he's reclaiming part of a farming system, but also it was, he believed, his inheritance. That it had been carried on for generation after generation of Swabian farmer, and now he had reclaimed it, brought it back, and then had encouraged, I think more than 100 farmers now are growing this lentil. And it's a commercial, it's commercially successful. People want it and they love it. And I think more significantly, that story has inspired other parts of Europe, people to go back through the record books to figure out what was being grown and eaten through history. And so it inspired people in Sweden to look back through monastic records, to look at the pea and bean diversity that kept people alive in those parts of the world. And in turn, it inspired some of the speakers at this conference. Josiah and Nick from Hodmedods have been here. And again, this idea of looking back and then realizing that on these islands, during the Iron Age, that fava beans were being grown. So, in a sense, it's a powerful story because it does tell us about extinction, but also recovery and revival,
and also a business. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things here at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, of course, is, I mean, I might be biased, but actually there seem to be quite a lot of Oxford scientists, Oxford food producers, Oxford farmers that popped up in different pages. And I was very struck by the story of Juniper Barry, who recovered the apple seed. So perhaps we could, before we open to questions from the audience and or comments and online, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, well, I was lucky. I mean, I have been lucky to be able to travel to visit some of the stories around the world. But I think one of the I think that one of the trips that had the most impact on me was an hour away from where I live, and that was a walled orchard in Oxford. I'd wanted to tell the story of the wild apple forests of Kazakhstan. And this is a place, actually, that Vavilov had visited in the late 1920s. And Vavilov had a hunch that this was the origin of all of the apples around the world, began in these wild fruit forests. And that was the theory, but there wasn't the science. And the science is important, because if that was the place where all of the apple genetics really come from, then we need to really protect that diversity, because that location represents everything that the apple has been and will be in the future, because that's the gene pool of all apples. So I was researching this story, and I came across the work of Barry Juniper, a botanist based in Oxford, who I then realized when the Soviet Union collapsed and a lot more research became possible in former Soviet countries, Barry Juniper was one of the first scientists from around the world to travel into those forests, because he wanted to actually prove that this place was the origin of all apples. And so he brought back some of the genetic material, and then to have a reference collection, he sourced apples from all over the world, and he planted an orchard in Oxford of the most wonderful diversity you could imagine. And so when I was writing the book back in 2018, he invited me, and we went into the orchard, and we went apple picking and told the wonderful story of tree by tree, the history of something that had been found as a seedling that then became a commercial variety in the early 1800s, or an apple that was referenced by Shakespeare or in a Shakespeare play. And so what Barry did was to match the genetics of the apple forests of Kazakhstan with all of the diversity that he could find, and he was right. Vavilov was right, and Barry Juniper came up with the evidence that every apple that we eat today originates in the wild forests of Kazakhstan, and we should be interested in that story, because for various reasons there's been huge amounts of deforestation. Lots of the swathes of that wild forest is being lost, and it represents so much of the diversity in our food, that those centres of origin and diversity are valuable global resources. And it's being lost, it's disappearing. And hopefully Barry Juniper's work will be one of the arguments why more protection will be provided in future. I mean, there are reserves within that area as well, but there's, again, huge amounts of urbanization, lots of commercial planting of apples as well, so the gene pool is being changed and weakened as well. But yeah, that trip to Oxford, I will always remember.
Yeah. No, when you tell it beautifully. So are there questions in the hall? And for Dan, would anyone like to ask a question? Oh, yes, please. Yes. Yeah, stand up. That would be great.
A mic is coming to you, so if you just... Yeah.
Hello, I'm Jane Cooper from Orkney. I farm Borrow sheep up there. Thank you, Dan, for your book, which, if anyone hasn't read it, it's a must. The stories he tells are fabulous. I just want to say a good story for you is that we are on the Ark of Taste. Not just that, I've rescued the last remnants of this unique subgroup of sheep. Because I'm a little older than many people, I now have 8 farmers, all younger than me, We are a community farming these sheep for mutton. We are desperately trying to milk them and produce cheese, as was done 6,000 years ago, because I've tracked back the story that long. Wow. And we're also a Slow Food International Presidium now. So that's a good story for you. Yeah. And thank you so much for telling your stories.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thanks. And I mean, there is a huge amount of, I guess, reasons for concern raised in each of the stories, but I think threading through are stories of positivity because of it was only possible to tell these stories because somebody was out there saving one of these endangered foods and fighting to save diversity. And actually, I went to southwestern China and met a farmer, and Doreen Allen was there, and we met this farmer in there was nothing around him. I mean, there were no houses, it was just in the middle of nowhere. And he was saving so-called red-tipped glutinous rice. All the other farmers in his region had switched over to the government-issued kind of Green Revolution-type rice. But he'd clung on to this rice diversity. And I was wondering, how on earth are you surviving here commercially? Because how are you getting your rice to market? And this guy in his 70s got out his phone and he showed me WeChat, the app. And there he was in this remote farm in China selling his rice to people in Chengdu, in Beijing. And again, there's so many reasons for optimism because there are ways in which people are finding each other and networks and supply chains can be created now. And yeah, I think what you're doing is another positive story. And and the book is full of these people who have found a way in which it's possible to save diversity. So, yeah.
Another question there, the gentleman second row from the back, and there's someone next to the front. I think that's what's so just before the microphone gets there, is if you're doubting the value of what you're doing, read the book, because it shows you what every individual person does matters and can make a difference historically. Historians kind of know this.
Yeah, well, I think the thing, I think we all need to know the story, not necessarily just from the book, but I think we need to know how did we get to this point. I think,
Please.
I just want to share Patrick Holden, I wanted to share another positive story with you, Dan, about Welsh black oats, which it looked as though they used to be grown as a heritage variety widely in Wales, and it looked as though they'd gone extinct. And then a man who made it his business to try to find them, spent years looking for them, and then found a guy who was growing them for his chickens. And we are now part of a project where we're multiplying up the seeds, and we started with 2 sweet bottles full of black oats. And it wasn't just one variety, it was 2 or 3 varieties. So we've now got them up to about 100 kilograms. And I think those kind of things are happening all over the place now. And I think your book's been a big influence on that. So thank you, Dan.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And also, I mean, I see John Lett standing at the back there, who again was another person that helped in the research for the book. Because I had come back from Turkey and had been given some of the wheat that I was there. I'd met a group of farmers who were growing an emmer wheat, and I was trying to understand the significance of what they were growing, and in that region the idea that this was 8,000 years of harvests and they were still growing one of the oldest types of wheat. And I arrived back and went again to this part of the world and to see John, and John got out his magnifying glass and looked and said, yeah, this is this is probably one of the oldest type of wheat being grown in the world. And these farmers were keeping it alive because they told me they loved the look of the wheat in the field. They loved the way it smelt when it was being milled and cooked. It felt like medicine to them when they were eating it, they said. And also because of where they were, the altitude, the humidity, nothing else would survive as well as this wheat. And now there are chefs in Istanbul who are helping, supporting them, putting it on his menu, telling this story to an urban audience about the history of that wheat in that historic part of the world in terms of agriculture. And after years in which it looked as if that was going to be an extinction story, that's again a commercially viable crop. And again, my thanks to John for that moment when we sat there and he said, this is the wheat that the people who built the pyramids would have been farming and eating, and the people who erected Stonehenge would have been familiar with. This is a resource, an inheritance for us all, really.
Yeah, I suppose, and that connects so much of the political economy, but also the history of peoples, that there's a kind of, it's human health, but it's also something that binds our communities and our cultures in ways that are very powerful. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Christopher Stokes from Organic Farmers and Growers, and I want to ask a question about diversity. It's been a central theme in what you've been talking about today. It's essential for all of us as far as we can see. I noticed that in the Environment Act targets that were published recently, abundance of species was mentioned, nothing about diversity. What would you say would be the 4 key reasons you'd give to policymakers as to why diversity is in some ways more important than abundance? And what are the 4 key barriers that you see to enabling diversity? And in a sense, why is it that we're only talking about abundance? I've got an abundance of pigeons in my garden, but not a lot else. So abundance is not a measure of environmental success, whereas diversity is, and also historically the benefit in terms of all the multitude of the products of diversity.
I can make a few points, which is one, that there is a huge amount of work that is taking place behind the scenes that I think is interesting and important to watch. So I think there's the Crop Wild Relatives project, for example, that a lot of the so-called pre-breeders are engaging with. So I think a recognition that across the board global commodities have become far too uniform. And so I think the science is now being applied. At NIAB in Cambridge, for example, they are going through the seed banks, the gene banks, and with the assistance of places like Kew, Royal Botanic Gardens, sourcing some of the genetic material and bringing diversity back into the crop. How far that will go and whether we'll just see the a replication of more monocultures, I don't know, but at least the science is now happening in which diversity is being brought back in. I guess at a larger scale, what unfolded in India last year with extreme temperatures and failure of wheat harvests and rice as well, and the fact that they lobbied the UN to declare this to be the year of millets is significant, because I think you might wonder, well, what does declaring a year of millets mean? But I think that idea that the Indian government understands that there was so much expansion, certainly under British rule as well, of the loss of these tiny diverse grains that are far more resilient to lack of water, can contribute to some of the nutrient deficiencies in the Indian population, particularly among women. There is going to be an educational program for different states around India to bring millets back into cultivation, that the population is going to be more education, more information, more access to millets, and including how to cook millets again. So I think the policy triggers are there and in response to crisis, but we need to be more proactive. And I think if you see some parts of Europe, for example, and perhaps most famously Copenhagen as a city taking a more proactive position on this, in the public procurement contracts, saying that diversity should be included alongside how much something costs. and that as a feedback loop to farmers and growers to bring diversity back into the supply chains that will end up in schools and hospitals and care homes or whatever. So, and I know this has been covered in many of the other sessions, but unless at one of these future COPs, the issue of how we use subsidies as a powerful mechanism of change, they're going to stay at small city-scale levels. We need global change in supporting diversity with some of the reallocation of subsidies.
Can I ask you, Dan, following on from that, I think it's interesting at a UN level, so that's where more of my research is located on global governance. Food is the one area around, at the moment, where nothing is really working in global governance, certainly around the UN. There's lots of tensions, lots of difficulty. Food is the one area that they're gaining traction. But I sometimes feel a little bit uneasy about how that sits with the kind of notion of food security, because food security gives food power as a kind of political, when you're making the political argument to take food as the priority and not treat it as a kind of, item number 3 when you're waging a war. But does it risk pushing the abundance argument? Because by saying it's about security, it means you've got to just have a lot of whatever it is.
And again, it's that defined security, because I think it's between short-term, solving one crisis after another, and long-term strategic thinking. Because I think any long-term strategic thinking, which is underway at the moment, so for example with, outside of the UN framework, but just to give an example, so a multi-billion-dollar industry, the coffee industry globally, is going to be seriously challenged by climate change, because the two main species that the industry depends on, Arabica and Robusta, either in terms of temperature or access to water, yields will go down, disease will go up, and we will have a problem eventually with global coffee supply, which is why there are botanists who've traveled to Africa, to Sierra Leone, to find some of the last remaining trees of Stenophylla, which is one of the coffee species that went out of production in the 1950s, but actually is as good tasting, they tell me, I haven't tasted it because it's such a rare coffee, as Arabica, and yet can survive at a higher temperature and with less water. That currently has created a program in which there are seedlings in Sierra Leone, but it will take decades in which that crop will be added to the global commodity production of Arabica and Robusta. So that's the kind of, that's food security in a way, and that's security for the farmers, the growers, and also for the people who consume, coffee. But we're talking about that kind of timescale. And likewise with, the Cavendish and the bananas, that research is underway. One solution will be to go down the biotech route, but the most powerful argument, and even from the practitioners of some of the CRISPR technology that's finding solutions to the Panama disease, is diversity needs to be brought back into that production. So, I think short-term thinking, you've got the UN agencies, including the World Food Programme, who are solving a growing crisis of hunger in the world, but we do need that longer-term strategy of bringing back diversity, and all of those UN agencies are involved in projects that are doing exactly that.
But I think that's the challenge. It's also across so many different agencies, isn't it? Somebody online has asked the question, what's your view on genetic editing of food?
And this does fit, I just mentioned one example. So there is an Australian scientist who is working with CRISPR on the Cavendish. And there is great concern in some of the places of the world that he's been working, for example, in Uganda, of farmers who have a history of working with 40, 50, 60 different varieties of banana, all with their different uses. So some for cooking, some as a fruit, a dessert fruit, some for brewing, for example. And obviously the idea is that this CRISPR technology will be another pressure forcing that diversity out and to be lost. I don't disagree with the research taking place, but I think it's this, and this is why the history is so important, that we have these technological breakthroughs, the science arrives, and then there's a reductionist position taken in which that is the fix. And yet we've seen, from the emergence of crop breeding science at the beginning of the 20th century, right through to the Green Revolution, these are short-term fixes in which we found the answer, and yet the complexity of the systems we're working with are then revealed to us. And I mentioned in the book that even Norman Borlaug, one of the chief architects of the Green Revolution, believed it was a project that would only last for 25 years before we could find another longer-term solution of how we can feed the world. Because the level of uniformity is catching up with us.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that's one of the things that's very striking to me, is the way that food emerges as the primary concern at a point of crisis. So you can see it in 1914, at the start of the First World War. You see it at the end of the First World War because of the impact of the blockade as a tool, and then also, the way that it affected Central and Eastern Europe. You see it in the Second World War, and you see it now. but then you see it disappear again. I can tell you it goes again in the 50s and the 60s.
And I think that probably explains why why Borlaug's argument that this was a 25-year project just carried on, because I think there was complacency that we found the solution. And now in the 21st century, whether it's in terms of soil, water, public health, etc., it's more complicated.
So does anyone else in the room have a question? Oh yes, please, over here. That hand went shooting up. Just...
Thank you. Stephen Parsley, I'm an organic farmer. While we're on technology, Dan, do you have any comments around vertical farming? Those who espouse the benefits of technology solving all these issues often talk about vertical farming as providing lots of cheap food. Do you have any comments about the nutrient quality of the stuff that they're producing, and whether the density is there to feed the world cheaply?
It's not a subject that I explore in the book, but I would refer back to that argument that I made before about the very latest science revealing the complexity of existing systems, traditional food systems, the complexity of the relationship between soil, crops, plants, animals, and us. And so, I think that science, for me at least, certainly in terms of the research that I've been reading and the people I've been speaking to, whether vertical farming in any way can replicate some of the complexities that I've just mentioned, I think is a very, very big question.
Yes, please, here.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for the book. It's fantastic. I have a couple of questions. The first question is, you divide the book into different sections based on food groups. What are the main reasons that you found from your travels, from meeting with people, that led to food extinction? And were there one specific group, grain, vegetable, meat, fish, that were more prone to extinction than others? So that's my first question. And the second question, excuse my ignorance if there is such a thing, but I am a researcher at Exeter, food system researcher, but also I do something called farm school. And one of the things I did is I traveled one summer in 2018 to Turkey, to an island called Gökçeada. It's one of the little islands in the Aegean Sea where no pesticides are being used. And I spent some time with farmers there, and there was one of the farmers that was very generous, that he shared one of his marrows with me, and he cut it open before I left, and he gave me all the seeds. And I went back and I took these seeds, preserved them, and grew them with the community in Exeter. And then we have years and years of of harvesting this, and amazing experiences of relating to this type of food and being able to experience it. And that made me think, reading your book, which is really mind-boggling to think that people think about animal extinction but not food extinction, which is food is us, is how can we raise people's awareness a bit more on this? Is there such thing as food diversity museum, for example, that is split into different food groups where people can go and actually have a relationship with these types of food? I mean, when I was reading your book, there are some varieties that I was reading. I was really intrigued. I wanted to see them. I wanted to smell them, feel them. Is there such thing?
Well, all right.
So that's the final question and the final answer, really. How can people get more involved in this quest for food diversity?
Well, possibly going down the same route that I went, really, which is, it's a virtual museum, but I think the Ark of Taste really is an amazing resource to actually understand what's still out there. And there is a part of the Ark of Taste dedicated to what still can be found in the UK. So you might not be able to touch it, taste it, smell it, but I think that, for me, is an important way in which people can just travel around the world and just explore the food diversity that exists there. And also, we can be proactive. Like I mentioned with the rice farmer in China with the WeChat app, we can, and we are here, part of a network in which we can create a different way of food being farmed and produced, and most importantly, to contact people who are interested in the food and the stories. So I think, I would recommend people explore the Ark of Taste. I know we're out of time, but that would be my recommendation. But I think, however you find the story, just to know the story of that history of how we got here, and to have the positive idea that there are many, many, many thousands of people out there dedicating their lives to saving these endangered foods.
And I suppose you too, the other place to look might be to look you up and your website.
And there is something, there is Food Diversity Day happening on Friday, which is just a celebration, really, of these stories, a way in which you can engage, go online. So it's fooddiversityday.com. That's next Friday. And so again, it's just a way of bringing people together to help understand this story, really, and to understand that they can make a difference and act on some of the stories that will be told and that you can read. But we can all play a part. So
there's always volume 2. So thank you very much, Dan. Thank you to the book, and thank you to all of you for your comments and